The highway stretched out like a gray ribbon under the early morning sun, and Sergeant Major Elijah Carter had been driving for nearly 7 hours straight. His hands gripped the steering wheel with the same steady calm he'd carried through 23 years in the Marine Corps. In the passenger seat sat a pressed uniform, carefully covered in plastic, and on the dashboard was a printed graduation program with his son's name circled in blue ink. Tyler James Carter, Bachelor of Engineering. The word still made him shake his head in quiet amazement. Elijah had left the base at 3 in the morning. Most men his age would have flown, but he preferred the drive. It gave him time to think, time to process what this day really meant. His boy was graduating from college. Not just graduating, but doing it with honors. The kid who used to fall asleep over his homework was now walking across a stage to receive a degree that Elijah himself had never had the chance to earn. He pulled into a gas station just outside the city limits and stepped out to stretch his legs. His body was starting to feel the years. 46 wasn't old, but it wasn't young either, especially not when you'd spent 2 decades carrying heavy gear through deserts and mountains. He rolled his shoulders and walked inside to grab a coffee. The kid behind the counter looked up and immediately noticed the Navy cross pin on Elijah's collar. It was small, subtle, but anyone who knew what it meant understood the weight of it. The kid nodded respectfully and didn't charge him for the coffee. Elijah tried to pay anyway, but the kid refused. "My uncle served," he said simply. "Thank you for what you do." Elijah nodded back, accepted the coffee, and walked out. He never knew quite what to say in those moments. The medal wasn't something he wore for attention. It was part of the uniform, part of the story he carried. But the story itself, the one that earned him that medal, wasn't something he talked about much. 11 men, a firefight in Helmand Province, rounds coming in from 3 directions. He'd gone back 4 times, dragging men to safety while bullets tore through the air around him. The last man he'd pulled out had been hit in the leg and was bleeding badly. Elijah had tied a tourniquet with one hand while returning fire with the other. When it was over, they gave him the medal. He'd accepted it quietly, the same way he did everything else. But in his mind, he hadn't done anything special. He'd just done what needed to be done. You don't leave men behind. That's the code. That's the only thing that matters when everything else is falling apart. Now, as he got back on the highway, his mind drifted to Tyler. His son had grown up in a world shaped by those deployments. Birthdays missed. Christmases spent on the other side of the world. School plays where other dads sat in the audience while Tyler scanned the crowd hoping, just once, his father might make it home in time. Elijah carried the guilt of those absences like stones in his chest. But Tyler never complained. He understood, or at least he tried to. And somewhere along the way, he decided to make his father proud in his own way. Not through military service, but through education, through building something with his mind instead of his hands. Elijah respected that. He respected it deeply. The city skyline came into view around noon. Tall buildings, busy streets, the kind of place that always made Elijah feel slightly out of place. He was more comfortable in open spaces, or on a base where everyone spoke the same language. But today wasn't about comfort. Today was about showing up, about being there when it mattered most. He found the college campus without trouble. The graduation was being held in the main auditorium, a large brick building with wide steps leading up to double doors. People were already streaming in, families dressed in their best clothes holding flowers and balloons. Elijah parked, grabbed his uniform from the passenger seat, and changed in the car. He wanted to wear it today, not to show off, but because it represented the life he'd lived, the sacrifices he'd made, and the pride he felt in being Tyler's father. When he walked through those doors, the Navy cross glinted faintly on his chest. The auditorium was huge, with rows and rows of seats stretching back toward the high ceiling. A stage stood at the front, draped in the school's colors, with a podium and a long table where the diplomas would be handed out. Elijah checked his ticket. Row 3, seat 12, family section. He made his way down the aisle, nodding politely to the people he passed. He found his seat and settled in. Around him, families chatted excitedly, taking pictures, adjusting their clothes. Elijah sat quietly, hands folded in his lap, eyes scanning the stage. Somewhere behind those curtains, Tyler was probably nervous, running through his speech or checking his gown for the 100th time. Elijah smiled at the thought. Then he noticed them. Several rows back, off to the side, sat 6 young men in Navy SEAL dress whites. The uniforms were unmistakable, crisp and sharp, with the trident insignia gleaming on their chests. They weren't talking much, just sitting there with the kind of calm discipline that comes from years of training. One of them, a younger guy with dark hair and serious eyes, glanced toward the front and his gaze landed on Elijah. The SEAL's expression shifted. Recognition. He leaned over and whispered something to the man next to him. Then that man looked and then another. Within seconds, all 6 of them were looking at Elijah, not staring, just acknowledging. One of them, the dark-haired one, gave a small nod. Elijah returned it. He didn't know their names, but he knew the look. They were military. They'd seen combat. And judging by the way they carried themselves, they'd seen a lot of it. Elijah wondered if any of them had served in the same areas he had. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria. The wars that never seemed to end. But this wasn't the time to think about that. This was a graduation, a celebration, a day for families and futures. The auditorium continued to fill. More people poured in, finding their seats, greeting each other. Elijah checked his watch. 15 minutes until the ceremony started. He took a deep breath and let himself relax just a little. He'd made it. After all those years, all those miles, all those missed moments, he was finally here for one that mattered. And then he heard footsteps behind him. Heavy footsteps, purposeful. Elijah didn't turn around right away. He'd spent enough time in situations where you learn to read a room by sound alone. These footsteps weren't casual. They had intent. They were coming toward him. 2 men appeared at the end of his row. Security guards, both wearing dark uniforms with radios clipped to their belts. One was tall and broad-shouldered, the other shorter but with a hard, unsmiling face. They stopped right next to Elijah's seat. The shorter guard spoke first. "Excuse me, sir. We're going to need you to move." Elijah looked up at them, calm but confused. "Move? Why?" The taller guard gestured vaguely toward the front. "This section's for immediate family only. You'll need to relocate to general seating." Elijah reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his ticket, holding it up so they could see. "This is my seat. Row 3, seat 12. Family section. My son's graduating today." The shorter guard didn't even glance at the ticket. "We've been told this area's full. There's plenty of room in the back." Something cold settled in Elijah's chest. Not anger, not yet. Just awareness. The kind of awareness you develop when you realize a situation isn't what it seems. He kept his voice level. "Who told you it was full?" "I have a confirmed ticket." The taller guard shifted his weight, uncomfortable now. "Look, we're just doing our job. Let's not make this difficult." Elijah didn't move. He'd faced worse than 2 security guards. Much worse. But this wasn't a battlefield. This was his son's graduation. And he'd be damned if he was going to let anyone take this moment away from him. "I'm staying right here," he said quietly. The shorter guard's face hardened. "Sir, if you don't cooperate, we'll have to escort you out." And just like that, the day that was supposed to be perfect started to unravel. The auditorium buzzed with excitement around them, but in that small pocket of space where Elijah sat, everything had gone still and tense. People in nearby seats were starting to notice the confrontation. A woman 2 rows ahead glanced back with concern. A father holding a toddler slowed his walk down the aisle, sensing something wasn't right. Elijah kept his hands folded in his lap, but his jaw tightened. He'd been in enough situations to know when someone was looking for a reason to escalate, and these 2 guards were checking all the boxes. The shorter one especially seemed eager to prove something. "Sir, I'm going to ask you one more time," the shorter guard said, louder now, making sure people could hear. "You need to move to the back or we're going to have a problem." Elijah looked up at him, meeting his eyes directly. "I have a ticket. My name is on the list. My son is graduating in 15 minutes. I'm not looking for trouble, but I'm also not moving." The taller guard sighed like he'd seen this before and was tired of it. "Look, man, we got complaints about seating. Someone said there was confusion in this section. We're just trying to sort it out." "Confusion about what?" Elijah asked calmly. "I'm sitting in my assigned seat." "Yeah, well, somebody said it wasn't right," the shorter guard shot back. "So now we're here dealing with it." Elijah's mind worked quickly. Someone complained, but who? He'd been sitting here quietly for 10 minutes, hadn't said a word to anyone, hadn't bothered anyone. The seats around him were filled with other families, all minding their own business. So what exactly was the complaint about? He already knew the answer. He'd known it the moment they walked up. It wasn't about the seat. It was never about the seat. "I'd like to speak to your supervisor," Elijah said, his voice still calm, still respectful. "If there's an issue with my ticket, I'm happy to sort it out with someone in charge." The shorter guard's face flushed red. "I am in charge of this section, and I'm telling you to move. Then I'd like to speak to whoever's in charge of you. You think this is a negotiation?" The guard snapped. His hand drifted toward the radio on his belt. "Last chance. Get up and move, or I call for backup and we remove you." A few seats away, an older woman leaned over to her husband and whispered something. Another man pulled out his phone, not recording yet, but holding it ready. The energy in the room was shifting. This wasn't just two guards doing their job anymore. This was becoming a scene. Elijah took a slow breath. He'd been in worse situations, but this one stung in a different way. He wasn't being threatened by enemy fighters or facing down danger. He was being humiliated in front of dozens of people at his own son's graduation. And the worst part was knowing that if he stood up for himself too hard, they'd use it against him. They'd say he was aggressive, that he was causing a disturbance, that he wouldn't cooperate, so he made a choice. The same choice he'd made 100 times before in his life. He decided to take the high road even when the high road meant swallowing his pride. "All right," he said quietly, starting to stand. "I don't want to ruin this day for my son or anyone else. I'll move." The shorter guard looked almost disappointed, like he'd been hoping for more of a fight. The taller one just nodded and gestured toward the back of the auditorium. "General seating's in the rear. Plenty of space back there." Elijah picked up his program and stepped into the aisle. He could feel eyes on him from every direction. Some people looked confused. Others looked uncomfortable. A few seemed to understand exactly what was happening and didn't like it one bit. As he walked toward the back, his mind was racing. He'd be sitting so far away he'd barely be able to see Tyler's face when his name was called. All those hours of driving, all that anticipation, and now he'd be watching his son's proudest moment from the cheap seats, while other families sat comfortably up front. But he kept walking, because that's what you do. You take the hit. You stay calm. You don't give them an excuse to make things worse. He was halfway up the aisle when he heard a voice behind him. "Sergeant Major Carter?" Elijah stopped. He turned around slowly, and his eyes found the source of the voice. It was one of the Navy SEALs, the dark-haired one who'd nodded at him earlier. The young man was standing now along with the 5 others. They weren't moving yet, just standing there in their dress whites, watching. The SEAL's name tag read Mateo. He looked to be in his late 20s, with sharp features and the kind of bearing that came from years of intense training. His eyes were locked on Elijah with an expression that was hard to read. Respect, maybe, or recognition, or something else entirely. "Yes," Elijah said, his voice carrying across the rows of seats. Mateo glanced at the 2 security guards, then back at Elijah. "Is there a problem, sir?" The shorter guard immediately stepped forward. "This doesn't concern you. Please sit down." But Mateo didn't sit. None of them did. They just stood there, 6 Navy SEALs in full dress uniform, creating a silent wall of presence that was impossible to ignore. "I asked the Sergeant Major a question," Mateo said, his tone polite but firm. "Is there a problem?" Elijah hesitated. Part of him wanted to say no, to wave it off and keep moving. He didn't want to cause a scene, didn't want to drag these young men into something that had nothing to do with them. But another part of him, the part that had spent decades standing up for his Marines, felt something stir. "They're asking me to move," Elijah said simply. "Said there's confusion about seating." Mateo's jaw tightened. He looked at the guards. "He has a ticket?" "That's none of your business," the shorter guard said, his voice rising. "Sit down, or you're going to be asked to leave too." One of the other SEALs, a broad-shouldered guy with a slight scar on his cheek, leaned over and whispered something to Mateo. Then another SEAL pulled out his phone and started scrolling, looking for something. The 6 of them moved with the kind of quiet coordination that comes from working together in high-pressure situations. By now, half the auditorium was watching. The ceremony was supposed to start in less than 10 minutes, but nobody seemed to care about that anymore. This was more interesting than any speech. A school administrator, a middle-aged woman with a clipboard and a stressed expression, hurried over. "What's going on here?" "We're about to start," the taller guard pointed at Elijah. "We're handling a seating issue." "He has a ticket," Mateo said before anyone else could speak. "Row 3 family section, confirmed. We can all see it right there on his program." The administrator looked confused. She glanced at Elijah, then at the guards, then at the 6 SEALs who were standing like statues in the middle of the auditorium. I don't understand. If he has a ticket, why is he being moved? We got a complaint, the shorter guard said, but he was starting to sound less confident now. A complaint about what? The administrator asked. Nobody answered. Because there was no good answer. There was no legitimate complaint. There was just a man sitting quietly in his assigned seat, waiting to watch his son graduate. The administrator looked at Elijah more closely now, and her eyes landed on the Navy cross on his chest. Her expression changed. Sir, are you military? Marine Corps, Elijah said. 23 years. She turned to the guards, and her voice dropped to a tone that suggested this conversation was about to go in a very different direction. Why exactly are you asking a decorated service member to leave his assigned seat? The shorter guard opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Mateo spoke again. That's Sergeant Major Elijah Carter, he said, his voice carrying through the room. He holds the Navy Cross. He pulled 11 men out of an ambush in Helmand Province. 3 of the men in this room right now are alive because of him. The auditorium went completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Every eye was on Elijah now, and the atmosphere had shifted from curiosity to something much more powerful. People weren't just watching anymore. They were paying attention. They were understanding, and the 2 security guards suddenly looked very, very small. The silence hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. Every person in that auditorium had stopped what they were doing. Mothers holding cameras lowered them. Kids fidgeting in their seats went still. Even the ushers by the door stood frozen, watching the scene unfold. Elijah stood in the aisle, his face unreadable. He wasn't the type to seek attention or make speeches about his service. The medal on his chest wasn't there to impress anyone. It was just part of the uniform, part of who he was. But now, with hundreds of eyes on him and Mateo's words echoing through the space, there was no hiding from it. The shorter security guard's face had gone from red to pale. His hand, which had been hovering near his radio, dropped to his side. The taller guard took a small step back, suddenly looking like he wanted to be anywhere else. The administrator stared at Elijah, then at the guards, and you could see the calculations happening behind her eyes. This wasn't just about a seating dispute anymore. This was about optics, about reputation, about what kind of story would be told after everyone left this building. And right now the story being written was not a good one for the college. Sergeant Major Carter, she said, her voice much softer now, almost apologetic. I'm so sorry for this confusion. Of course you should be in your assigned seat. Please let me personally escort you back. But Mateo wasn't done. He took a step forward, and the other 5 SEALs moved with him, not aggressively, just present, solid, unmovable. With respect, ma'am, Mateo said, his eyes still on the guards. I think we all need to understand what just happened here. This man drove 8 hours to watch his son graduate. He had a valid ticket. He was sitting quietly, bothering no one, and he was told to leave. I think someone needs to explain why. The shorter guard opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at his partner, who suddenly became very interested in his shoes. Nobody wanted to say what everyone in the room was thinking. An older man in the front row stood up. He was wearing a veteran's cap, the kind with patches and pins from different units and campaigns. His voice was gravelly and strong. I served in Vietnam, spent 2 tours in the Mekong Delta, and I'll tell you something right now. If this man is being removed because of what I think he's being removed for, then we got a real problem here. A woman a few rows behind him stood as well. My husband died in Iraq. He believed he was fighting for something better. For dignity. For respect. This is not respect. Then another person stood. And another. Within 30 seconds, at least 20 people were on their feet. And the look on the administrator's face said she knew she was losing control of the situation. One of the other SEALs, a quieter guy with glasses and steady eyes, spoke up. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the noise. Afghanistan 2019. Our convoy got hit with an IED, 3 vehicles destroyed. We were taking fire from multiple positions and couldn't get air support because of the weather. Sergeant Major Carter wasn't even assigned to our unit. He was passing through on rotation. But when he heard the call over the radio, he turned his vehicle around and drove straight into the fight. He paused, and the emotion in his voice was raw, real. He pulled me out of a burning Humvee. My leg was shattered. I couldn't walk. He carried me 300 yards under fire, got me to the medevac, then went back for others. I wouldn't be standing here today without him. Another SEAL stepped forward, this one with a thick southern accent. He came back 4 times. 4 times. We lost good men that day, but we didn't lose all of us because of him. So when I see him being disrespected like this at his own son's graduation, it's personal. Real personal. The taller guard held up his hands, his voice cracking slightly. Look, we were just following orders. Someone complained, we had to respond. That's protocol. Who complained? Mateo asked, his tone sharp now. Give us a name. The guard looked helpless. I don't know. It came through the radio. They just said there was an issue in this section. An issue, Mateo repeated, letting the word hang there. What kind of issue? Too much quietness? Too much sitting properly? Help me understand. The administrator stepped between them, holding up her clipboard like a shield. Gentlemen, please. I'm sure this was just a misunderstanding. These things happen in large events. Let's all take a breath and remember we're here for the students. You're right, Mateo said, his voice dropping to something calmer but no less firm. We are here for the students. And one of those students is about to watch his father get escorted out of the building for no reason. What kind of lesson is that? A younger man near the middle of the auditorium raised his phone. I've been recording this whole thing, he called out. And I'm not the only one. This is going to be all over social media in about 5 minutes. Just so everyone knows, the administrator's face went white. In the age of viral videos and cancel culture, this was a nightmare scenario. She turned to Elijah and her voice took on a desperate edge. Please, Sergeant Major, let me make this right. Your seat is waiting for you. I'll personally make sure no one bothers you again. But Elijah didn't move yet. He was looking at the 6 SEALs, these young men who'd stood up for him without being asked. Men who had their own families here, their own reasons for being present, but who chose to put themselves in an uncomfortable situation because it was the right thing to do. You didn't have to do this, Elijah said to them, his voice thick with emotion. But thank you. Mateo shook his head.
Sir, with respect, we did have to.
You taught us that. You taught us that when something isn't right, you don't just sit there and let it happen. You step up, even when it's uncomfortable. Even when it costs you something. The SEAL with glasses nodded. You were there for us when it mattered most. This is us being there for you. The administrator looked between them all, realizing that the only way this ended well was complete capitulation. Sergeant Major Carter, please. Return to your seat. And gentlemen, she addressed the guards, I think your services are no longer needed in this section. Please report to the main security office. The shorter guard looked like he wanted to argue, but the taller one grabbed his arm and pulled him away. They disappeared through a side door and you could hear murmuring in their wake. Nobody in the audience looked sympathetic to them. Elijah walked back down the aisle, and as he passed each row, people reached out to touch his arm, to shake his hand, to thank him. An elderly woman with tears in her eyes pressed a small American flag pin into his palm. A young father held up his toddler and said, This is what a hero looks like, buddy. Remember this. When Elijah reached row 3, the people sitting near his seat had shifted slightly, making sure there was plenty of room. Nobody questioned his presence now. Nobody looked at him sideways. He sat down, and the 6 SEALs returned to their seats behind him. The administrator hurried to the front, spoke quickly to someone behind the curtain, and then the lights dimmed. Music began to play. The ceremony was finally starting. But before the first graduate walked out, Mateo leaned forward and tapped Elijah on the shoulder. When Elijah turned, the young SEAL was holding out a small card with a phone number written on it. After today, if you or your son ever need anything, call that number, Mateo said. Any of us, anytime, anywhere. That's a promise. Elijah took the card, his throat too tight to speak. He just nodded, and that was enough. The curtains opened. The graduates began filing onto the stage. Young men and women in caps and gowns, full of hope and pride and the promise of futures not yet written. The audience erupted in applause, and the awkwardness of the last 20 minutes seemed to dissolve into the excitement of the moment. But Elijah knew, and the SEALs knew, and everyone who'd witnessed what happened knew, that something important had occurred in this room. Something that went beyond graduation ceremonies and family photos. A line had been drawn. A stand had been taken. And in a world where it's often easier to look away, to stay quiet, to let things slide, a group of people had chosen differently. As the first names were called and graduates walked across the stage, Elijah's eyes scanned the line of students. Somewhere in that group was Tyler, probably nervous, probably wondering what all the commotion had been about. Elijah couldn't wait to see his face, to watch him receive that diploma, to tell him later about the men who'd stood up when it mattered. The ceremony continued, and with each name called, the moment drew closer. Elijah's heart pounded in his chest, not from stress this time, but from pure anticipation and love. The names kept coming, one after another, each graduate walking across the stage to applause and cheers from their families. The dean of the college stood at the podium reading from a long list, pausing between each name to let the moment sink in. Every student got their 5 seconds of glory, their brief time in the spotlight before moving their tassel and stepping back into the crowd. Elijah watched each one, but his mind was only half present. The other half was replaying the last 30 minutes over and over, trying to process what had happened. The confrontation, the humiliation, the way those young SEALs had stood up without hesitation, the way strangers had risen from their seats to support him. It was almost too much to hold in his chest. Behind him, the 6 SEALs sat quietly, but their presence was like an anchor, solid, steady. Every now and then, Elijah could hear one of them whisper something to the others, could feel their attention focused on the stage just like his. They were waiting too, waiting for Tyler's name. The dean continued reading. Rebecca Johnson, Daniel Kim, Ashley Martinez. Each name brought fresh applause, fresh celebration. Parents stood and shouted. Siblings whistled. It was loud and chaotic and beautiful in the way these moments always are. Then, about 40 minutes into the ceremony, the dean paused longer than usual. She looked down at her paper, then out at the audience, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a weight that hadn't been there before. Tyler James Carter. The room seemed to hold its breath for just a second, and then it erupted. Elijah shot to his feet so fast he nearly knocked his program to the floor. His eyes locked onto his son as Tyler stepped forward from the line of graduates. The kid looked nervous, his hands clasped in front of him, his shoulders squared in that way he always did when he was trying to appear confident. But Elijah could see the slight tremor in his jaw, could see the way his eyes scanned the audience looking for one face in particular. And then Tyler found him. Their eyes met across the distance, father and son, and Tyler's expression crumbled for just a moment. Relief, joy, love, all of it flashed across his face before he pulled himself together and kept walking toward the center of the stage. But the applause didn't stop. In fact, it got louder. Elijah was clapping, tears streaming openly down his face now, not caring who saw. But then he realized he wasn't the only one standing. The 6 SEALs had risen as one, their hands coming together in thunderous, synchronized applause. Not wild or chaotic, but measured and powerful, like a drumbeat. And then others stood. The veteran in the front row with his patches and pins. The woman who'd spoken about her husband. The young father with the toddler. Row by row, people got to their feet, and the sound built into something that felt less like applause and more like a wave crashing over the room. Tyler stood on the stage, frozen, his eyes wide. The dean had to wait, smiling as the noise continued. She glanced at Tyler and mouthed something that might have been "your dad," and Tyler nodded, his own eyes getting wet. When the applause finally began to fade, the dean handed Tyler his diploma. He shook her hand, then turned to face the audience one more time. He found his father again in the crowd, and this time he didn't try to hide the emotion. He pressed his fist to his chest right over his heart and held it there. A silent salute. Elijah did the same, his fist over his own heart, and the gesture said everything that words couldn't. I see you. I'm proud of you. I love you. Tyler walked off the stage and the ceremony continued, but for Elijah, everything else was just noise. His son had graduated. He'd been there to see it, and despite everything that had tried to stop him, despite the guards and the confrontation and the ugliness of it all, the moment had happened exactly as it was supposed to. The rest of the ceremony passed in a blur. More names, more applause, a speech from the college president about bright futures and endless possibilities. Elijah heard it all but absorbed none of it. He was too busy replaying that moment when Tyler had looked at him, when his son's face had lit up with recognition and joy. Finally, after what felt like both an eternity and no time at all, The ceremony ended. The graduates tossed their caps into the air in a tradition as old as college itself, and then the auditorium dissolved into controlled chaos as families rushed to find their students. Elijah stood and immediately felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Mateo, the lead SEAL, and behind him were the other 5. "Sir, we're going to head out," Mateo said. "Let you have your moment with your son. But it was an honor sitting behind you today, a real honor." Elijah shook each of their hands, looking them in the eyes, trying to communicate the depth of his gratitude. "You saved this day for me," he said. "I won't forget it." The SEAL with glasses, the one who talked about the burning Humvee, smiled. "You saved our lives, Sergeant Major. This was the least we could do." They filed out, moving through the crowd with practiced ease, and Elijah watched them go. These warriors who'd become guardians in an entirely different kind of battle. Then he turned and began making his way toward the stage, pushing through the sea of people. Families everywhere hugging and crying and taking photos. Balloons bouncing overhead. Flowers being handed out. The energy was electric. He spotted Tyler near the side of the stage, still in his cap and gown, surrounded by other graduates. But Tyler must have sensed his father approaching because he looked up. And when he saw Elijah pushing through the crowd, he broke away from his friends and started walking. They met in the middle, and without a word, Tyler threw his arms around his father. Elijah held him tight, tighter than he had in years, feeling how much his boy had grown, how solid and strong he'd become. Tyler was taller than him now, broader in the shoulders, but in that moment he felt like the same kid who used to wait by the window for his dad to come home from deployment. "You made it," Tyler said, his voice muffled against Elijah's shoulder. When I saw those guards talking to you, I thought they were going to kick you out." "They tried," Elijah admitted, "but some good people made sure that didn't happen." Tyler pulled back, wiping at his eyes. "Who were those guys in the Navy uniforms? The ones who stood up with you?" "Men I served with," Elijah said. "Good men. The best kind." They stood there for a moment, just looking at each other, and Tyler shook his head in disbelief. "This whole day has been insane. But having you here, Dad, that's what matters. That's all that matters." Elijah put his hands on his son's shoulders. "I'm so proud of you, Tyler, prouder than I know how to say. You did this. You worked hard, you stayed focused, and you earned this degree. Nobody gave it to you. You earned it." Tyler's chin trembled. "I wanted to make you proud. You did, you do. Every single day." Around them, other families were having their own moments, but for Elijah and Tyler, the world had narrowed to just the 2 of them. Years of missed birthdays, of phone calls from war zones, of worry and fear and long absences. All of it seemed to compress into this single point of connection. A photographer approached, asking if they wanted a picture. Tyler looked at his father and Elijah nodded. They stood together, Tyler in his graduation gown, Elijah in his dress uniform with the Navy cross glinting on his chest. The camera flashed, capturing a moment that would sit on mantles and in frames for years to come. As they walked out of the auditorium together, Tyler kept glancing at his father like he couldn't quite believe he was really there. "Are you staying for a few days?" he asked. "Or do you have to get back to base?" "I took leave," Elijah said. 3 whole days. I figured we could actually spend some time together. If you're not too busy with graduation parties and celebrating with friends." Tyler grinned. "I can make time for my old man." They stepped out into the sunlight and the campus was alive with celebration. Students everywhere, families taking photos on the lawn, vendors selling flowers and commemorative frames. It was a perfect day, warm and bright, the kind of day that felt designed for good things. As they walked toward the parking lot, Tyler said quietly, "Dad, what really happened in there? With those guards?" Elijah was silent for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes people make assumptions. Sometimes they see what they expect to see instead of what's really there. But today, enough people decided that wasn't okay. They stood up. They said something, and that made all the difference." Tyler nodded, processing that. "The world's changing," he said. "But not fast enough." "No," Elijah agreed. "Not fast enough. But days like today give me hope. Because when it mattered, people chose to do the right thing. That's what we hold on to." They reached Elijah's car and Tyler paused, his hand on the door. "Thank you for coming, Dad, for driving all this way. For being here even when they tried to stop you." Elijah pulled his son in for one more hug. "Nothing could have kept me away, nothing." They went to lunch at a small diner near campus. The kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and a menu that hadn't changed in 20 years. Tyler was still wearing his graduation gown, too excited to bother changing, and people kept stopping by their table to congratulate him. Each time, Tyler would introduce his father with a pride that made Elijah's chest ache in the best way. Over burgers and fries, they talked about everything and nothing. Tyler's plans for his engineering job starting in the fall, the apartment he'd signed a lease on, his friends and the party they were throwing later that night. Normal things. Good things. The kind of conversation Elijah had missed during all those years of deployment. But eventually, the conversation circled back to what had happened in the auditorium. "I saw it starting," Tyler said, pushing a fry around his plate. "I was backstage and one of my professors came over and said there was some kind of commotion in the audience. By the time I looked through the curtain, there were people standing everywhere and these guys in military uniforms confronting the security guards. I had no idea it was about you until I asked someone." Elijah took a sip of his coffee. "I didn't want it to become a thing. I just wanted to sit and watch you graduate." "But it was a thing," Tyler said, meeting his father's eyes. "And I'm glad those guys stepped in. Because if they hadn't—" He trailed off, his jaw tightening. "I would have walked off that stage, Dad. I was ready to. The moment I found out what was happening, I was done with the ceremony. You worked too hard for that degree to walk away from it, and you drove 8 hours to be there. You've sacrificed everything for me my whole life. You think I was going to just let them kick you out?" Tyler's voice cracked slightly. "That's my dad they were disrespecting. The man who's given more to this country than most people give to anything in their entire lives." Elijah reached across the table and squeezed his son's hand. "It worked out. That's what matters." But Tyler shook his head. "It shouldn't have happened in the first place. That's what matters." They sat in silence for a moment, both of them understanding that some truths are too big to wrap words around. The weight of what had occurred, what it represented, what it said about the world they lived in hung between them like something tangible. Tyler's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at it and his eyes went wide. "Dad, you need to see this." He turned the phone so Elijah could see the screen. It was a video, already with thousands of views and climbing fast. The title read, "Navy SEALs Stop Decorated Marine from Being Removed at Son's Graduation." Elijah watched as the scene he'd lived through played out on the small screen. There he was, standing in the aisle. There were the guards, and there were the 6 SEALs rising to their feet. The video had been filmed from several rows back, so you could see everything. The confrontation. The people standing up. Mateo's voice cutting through the noise, explaining who Elijah was and what he'd done. The comments were pouring in by the second. Messages of support, anger at the guards, praise for the SEALs. People sharing their own stories of discrimination, of being profiled, of being treated as less than. The video was becoming something bigger than just a moment caught on camera. It was becoming a symbol. "There are already news outlets reaching out," Tyler said, scrolling through his notifications. "They want interviews. They want to talk to you, to those SEALs, to anyone who was there." Elijah pushed the phone back across the table. "I'm not interested in being famous." "I know," Tyler said. "But maybe this needs to be talked about. Maybe people need to see it." "People are seeing it," Elijah said, gesturing to the phone. "Seems like half the internet already has." Over the next few hours, as they drove around the city and eventually back to Tyler's apartment, the video continued to spread. By evening, it had hit national news. A segment on a major network showed clips from the auditorium, interviewed some of the people who'd been there, and ran a brief profile on Elijah's military service. The Navy Cross, the 11 men saved in Helmand Province, the 23 years of dedication. Tyler's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Reporters, producers, even a few book agents. But Elijah had Tyler turn it off. This was supposed to be a celebration, not a media circus. That night, Tyler's friends threw the graduation party they'd planned, and Elijah stayed for a while, enjoying the energy of young people on the verge of their futures. But eventually he excused himself and stepped outside for some air. He found himself standing in the parking lot looking up at the stars when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned to see Mateo, the SEAL who'd first stood up in the auditorium. "Sir," Mateo said, approaching with his hands in his pockets. "Hope I'm not intruding. I saw the news coverage and figured I'd check in. Make sure you're okay." "I'm fine," Elijah said. "Better than fine, actually. My son graduated today. That's what I'm holding on to. Mateo nodded, standing beside him and looking up at the same sky. The videos everywhere. People are calling us heroes, but honestly, we were just doing what felt right. That's what makes it matter, Elijah said. You didn't do it for attention or credit. You did it because it needed to be done. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Two military men who understood things without needing to explain them. I got a call from the college president this afternoon, Mateo said finally. She wanted to apologize on behalf of the institution. Said they're reviewing their security protocols and implementing new training for staff about bias and discrimination. That's good, Elijah said. Real change is always good. She also said the two guards were let go. Effective immediately. Elijah's expression was unreadable. I don't take pleasure in people losing their jobs. Neither do I, Mateo agreed. But actions have consequences. They made a choice and it was the wrong one. True enough. Mateo shifted his weight, choosing his words carefully. Sir, I know you don't want to be in the spotlight, but I think what happened today matters. Not just for you or for us, but for everyone who's ever been made to feel like they don't belong somewhere they have every right to be. The video going viral means people are talking about it, and when people talk, sometimes things actually change. Elijah considered this. He'd spent his entire military career staying out of the spotlight, doing his job quietly and effectively. But maybe Mateo had a point. Maybe some moments were bigger than personal preference. I'll think about it, he said finally. Mateo smiled. That's all I'm asking, sir. He held out his hand and Elijah shook it firmly. Take care of yourself, and congratulations on your son. He seems like a good kid. The best, Elijah agreed. After Mateo left, Elijah stayed outside a while longer, thinking about everything that had happened. The morning drive full of anticipation. The confrontation that could have ended so differently. The SEALs who'd stood up. The strangers who'd supported him. Tyler walking across that stage with his head held high. And now the ripple effects spreading outward. Touching people he'd never meet. Starting conversations in living rooms and offices and schools across the country. He thought about all the times he'd stayed quiet. Let things slide. Taken the high road to avoid confrontation. And he realized that sometimes the high road meant standing your ground. Sometimes it meant letting other people see what happened so they could learn from it. When he went back inside, Tyler was laughing with his friends, looking more relaxed and happy than Elijah had seen him in years. Their eyes met across the room and Tyler gave him a thumbs up. Everything good? Elijah nodded. Everything good. Later that night, back in his hotel room, Elijah sat on the edge of the bed and pulled out his phone. He found the video, watched it one more time, and read through some of the comments. Stories from other veterans who'd faced similar situations. Messages from parents saying they were showing the video to their kids and talking about respect and dignity. Teachers saying they were using it as a discussion point in their classes about standing up for what's right. One comment in particular stuck with him. It was from a young woman who wrote, "My dad served for 15 years and never talked about it. He always said he was just doing his job. Watching this made me realize how much he gave up, how much all of them give up. I'm going to call him tomorrow and tell him I'm proud of him. Thank you for reminding me." Elijah set the phone down and lay back on the bed staring at the ceiling. Tomorrow he'd spend another day with Tyler. They'd have breakfast, maybe go see a movie, just be together without the weight of ceremony or drama. And the day after that, he'd drive back to base, back to his duties, back to the life he'd built over 2 decades of service. But something had shifted. Not just in the world's perception of what happened, but in his own understanding of why it mattered. He'd been fighting for others his entire life, on battlefields overseas, in training yards preparing the next generation, and yesterday, in a college auditorium where 6 young men had fought for him. The circle had come around, and in doing so, it had proven something he'd always believed but rarely seen demonstrated so clearly, that honor and respect aren't just military values. They're human ones, and when good people choose to stand up for them, even in small ways, even in everyday moments, they create ripples that spread farther than anyone can measure. Tyler was right. The world was changing, but not fast enough. But days like yesterday gave reason to